Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football Dill. That Tuesday in November, finally here. We get our first college football playoff rankings from the committee. And Dill, there's obviously a lot of football that needs to be played, but these rankings matter. Like, you get some people saying how the rankings don't matter early November. Getting a sense about how the committee evaluates certain teams, but I think more importantly, how they evaluate certain conferences is certainly a takeaway you can have from some of these early rankings. Fired up to pick it apart, get into it. Dill, I think the best part about doing this is hearing from everybody in the comment section. Everybody's got a different take in terms of how you want to stack these teams. Dill, we certainly don't agree in terms of our top 25 college football playoff rankings. Fired up to get into it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Dill, the fellas might be going live next Tuesday night. We don't do a ton of live stuff, but I think it'd be fun to get a lot of y'all's opinions and kind of instantly react to them. So appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Let it fly in the comment section. Dill, I think we got to start at the top here. Oregon, number one. I don't think anybody's going to argue that. Ohio State over Georgia. Number one, kind of giving you an inside look in terms of how the committee might evaluate the SEC and the Big Ten. But I think more importantly, I'd like to get your opinion on Ohio State, Georgia. How do you stack these two teams when you're talking about the top five teams in all of college football?
And this is one of the minor tweaks, let's say, the college football committee had versus the AP poll. But I think they are right. I mean, I just look at Georgia, like, until they answer some of the questions they have on offense, it's really hard to put them over an Ohio State team that does look really complete. I think Ohio State probably had a few questions on offense, especially with that offensive line. You go into Penn State and go into Happy Valley and take care of business and move the ball pretty well, show the ability to be explosive at times, but just flat out have an identity where you can lean on. And it's that rushing attack, especially with Will Howard being involved in it.
Andrew blocked Penn State up. Like that's one of the best pass rush units that we see in the country. You go on the road, you're starting an All-American guard who's now making his first start at left tackle. And I thought they acquitted themselves pretty well on the offensive line. Like, look, if you can answer your offensive line question marks against Penn State, you're kind of answering your offensive line question marks in general.
No, frankly, I'll still have a little bit of questions about what they can do if they need to throw the ball a little bit more, because they really didn't need to get into that. They didn't really throw from the pocket much at all.
Yeah, fair.
Against Penn State, and they didn't need to. But again, I mean, they have their identity. They know what they're going to be about. They're going to run the ball out. They're going to move Will Howard out of the pocket and roll him out. And it's going to probably work pretty well because, again, Penn State, you're right. Like, they are about as good of a defense as you'll see. Now, again, Georgia might be a little bit better equipped to deal with the rushing attack because they're bigger. They're more physical. So, like, maybe you could quibble at that. But, again, I think Ohio State's just been a more complete team than Georgia.
I think at the end of the day, you just do this. You give it the eyeball test, right? Like, both teams have one loss. Watch the Ohio State-Oregon game, and then watch the Georgia-Texas game or watch the Georgia-Alabama game and just say, who do you think are the top two teams in the country? Like, you watch that Oregon-Ohio State game and say, those, to me, from the eyeball test, look like they're the two best teams in the country. That's reflected in the rankings. And again, if you're a Georgia fan, I think there's another gear that Georgia can reach. Like, I think Georgia could certainly be the best team in the country at the end of the college football season, but they haven't looked at so far, specifically with some of the struggles that you've seen Carson Beck have. Though I think the second takeaway, the committee's pretty high on the ACC, right? Clemson does not drop out of the top 25 with not really an impressive win. Louisville's in the top 25. You have Pitt, SMU, and Miami. Though that's five teams in the top 25 of these college football playoff rankings. We were having the conversation of how many teams does the ACC get into the playoffs? I still think the answer is probably one if Miami wins out and wins the ACC championship. That being said, I think the door's open for two teams getting into the ACC championship, where a couple of days ago, I think 20 minutes ago, we were probably thinking there's only going to be one team in the ACC champion or in the ACC.
At this point, SMU's going to have a pretty decent resume at the end of the day if they continue to win. And again, if they beat Miami, I think you're guaranteed to have two teams. But even if they don't, I think you're going to have some real interesting conversations against three-loss SEC teams. I mean, you look in A&M and LSU and Ole Miss, if those two or a couple of those two teams have three losses, I think it's gonna be really hard to put them above that SMU squad
Oh,
right now.
I disagree with that. Where yes, Dill SMU. You look at SMU's schedule, like Boston College, at Virginia, Cal. They're gonna finish 11-1. I think they're gonna play for an ACC championship, and then it might have to deal with like, all right, how does SMU
They go
look
play a
against?
respectable game against Miami. I think they're really hard to leave off with some of these 3-loss SEC teams that'll have some gross ones, frankly. Like Ole Miss, LSU will have some really gross losses on their schedule. USC is not a good loss. Kentucky's not a good loss. Like there'll be some.
Yeah, no, and I'm with you. You look at what would be SMU's 2 losses would be potentially against the top 10 ranked BYU team. Now we'll see if they finish
Yeah,
that way towards the end of the year. And you're right, like they didn't even have Kevin Jennings starting, and then their other loss would be to Miami in the ACC championship. Like we said, Dill, I don't know if I'm buying that SMU is a top 12 team in the country, but like it or not, like we're gonna have the conversation about SMU
They
making
might
the
just
college football
they
playoff.
just smite Indiana you then. Like you'll hang on your no,
Maybe
they're not good, and then they'll just break you down. Well, if they keep
let
winning, then this is what it
let's
is.
talk about Indiana, where you with Ohio State at number 2, that even helps Indiana a little bit more. So say Indiana lose it. Look, I think Indiana is probably going to run the table outside of the Ohio State game. If they lose to Ohio State in a close one, I think these rankings right now reflect Indiana, an 11-1 Indiana is probably making the college football playoffs here.
I would think so. And especially if it's tight. Again, if they go get waxed by Ohio State,
Yeah.
that's certainly going to be an issue because you look like I mean, Notre Dame's not going to have a loss like that. And again, that NIU loss is gross, but they'll have good wins. I look at the teams above them. I shouldn't say Notre Dame won't have. They'll have probably the worst loss of any playoff team if they get
Yes.
in. But like they'll have wins. Alabama will have wins. A&M, LSU, those teams will have big wins.
Does Notre Dame actually have like outside of on the road at Texas A&M? That Notre Dame schedule,
That's infinitely better than anything else Illinois or Indiana, I should say, is going to have, which is always going to be the issue. Because A&M's a good school or good program.
I would. Yeah, okay, I can get that. I get Notre Dame. I think's going 11-1. I think they're making the college football playoffs, but you do have some question marks about the marquee wins. Yeah, I'm telling you, Notre Dame's got to be rooting for Texas A&M to finish off this season strong because that is kind of what they're hanging their hat on. Like if Texas A&M falls apart towards the back half of the year, like all of a sudden that one win on the road doesn't look that special anymore.
You are
Then you're
right,
having
though.
some
That
conversations.
one loss Indiana versus one loss Notre Dame, especially with how they have it shaking out right now, that'll get really, really interesting. Because again, like, will they punish Indiana for a loss to Ohio State? I
Yeah,
think they will a little bit, but it's going to be hard to knock them below. And you're right;
yeah.
it'll be hard to knock them below Notre Dame, and they already put them above. So
Okay, Dale. So I got another question for you that I think we're going to have a disagreement. I would love to hear from y'all in the comment section on this one, Dale. Ole Miss, they're coming in at 16. They don't have a very impressive resume right now, but the eyeball test, like I've been very adamant that I think this Ole Miss team is very good, and the ceiling of this Ole Miss team is certainly a college football playoff caliber team. My question to you is, do they control their own destiny? Like if you can beat Georgia, then you take care of it. I mean, you look at the schedule and say you waxed Arkansas. That was a great, and it looked good. Like you talk about the eyeball test is going to matter. That looked very good for Ole Miss. If you can beat Georgia at home, then you beat Florida on the road, you beat Mississippi State. Does it matter what happens in front of them, or do you think they're a college football playoff team if they win out, go 10-2 with a win against Georgia?
I actually think they're in good shape because let's say like A&M and LSU kind of run the table. I think all three are getting in, and you look, then Texas, Georgia, and Alabama are all going to have really hard times kind of convincing because a 2-loss Georgia versus a 2-loss Ole Miss with the head-to-head win it's like, do you think they can knock Georgia below Ole Miss? I kind of think they will because if Ole Miss runs it and Georgia loses to them, I don't know how you can in a
Yeah,
head-to-head
I
spot with both having 2 losses and Georgia not looking particularly great for chunks of the season. I almost think that'd be a crime to leave Ole
Do you
Miss
think
out.
if Ole Miss if Ole Miss beats Georgia at home, do you think Ole Miss jumps Georgia in the rankings?
No, I kind of don't, but I think that's not right. I think they should.
Yeah, because again, I
Again,
feel like
if Georgia was undefeated right now, I'd probably disagree with that. Like Georgia one loss versus a two-loss Ole Miss with some bad ones. I'd have a different we'd be singing a different tune. But again, Georgia hasn't looked like arguably that type of juggernaut. Again, I kind of think there's a little bit of distance, frankly, with the two at the top, Oregon and Ohio State. So if Georgia loses to Ole Miss and they're a two-loss team versus an Ole Miss two-loss team, I don't know how you cannot. I don't know how the head-to-head can't matter at that point.
yeah, I think that would
And I'm not a head-to-head end-all be-all guy. I don't agree with that. Like, okay, if Ohio State loses to Indiana, I don't necessarily say that. Well, that's not a great example. But if Ohio State loses to Michigan, let's say Michigan's not getting in, right? The resume matters to an extent. But when you have the same number of losses, you're in the same conference. The head-to-head really matters, I think, at that point.
Yeah, I think Alabama, Texas A&M, LSU, and Ole Miss are 4 teams in the SEC that are all in the same boat. They might be a little spread out in the rankings, but they're all in the same boat. Like, yeah, I think you're playing elimination games going forward, especially with how the committee spit these rankings out at, with how they're valuing the ACC. It's hard to see a 3-loss SEC team getting into the college football playoffs. And again, there's a lot of football left to be played, but I look at like Pitt coming in at 18 and say they like the ACC. Clemson coming in at 23. Where's their win that tells you they should be a top 25 team? They've looked solid, but they have not played very good teams. It's telling me that the committee thinks highly of the ACC, and that tells me that if 3-loss SEC team, I ain't sure if 3-loss SEC team is getting in at this point.
And
Still Missouri at
I think that's a little dependent on how many three-loss SEC teams there are. So if you see some upsets, that could probably open the door. But I think you're right. If it kind of goes straight, if you will, in like the teams that win should win and the teams that should lose, I don't think you're getting the three-loss SEC team in for the exact reason you mentioned. Like they're putting a lot of respect on the ACC's name, and then you're getting two of them probably.
Yeah, whether you like it or not, they're putting respect on the
And the
ACC's
Big
name.
Ten, frankly. You look because Indiana's probably gonna have a better chance than a three-loss SEC team, even if they
Yeah,
do
but
lose.
that's a no. In my opinion, that's a no-brainer. Like a 1-loss Indiana team that looks respectable against Ohio State, that's a no-brainer because Indiana has looked the part in a big time win. I get they haven't played elite college, but they'll play Michigan this weekend, and that'll be a good sense. Like I'm a Michigan fan. I know Michigan ain't great, but that's another quality team where if they look like Texas did playing Michigan, it's going to be hard to argue a 1-loss Indiana team shouldn't be getting into the college football playoffs. Still, the Big 12, I think we're both still in the same boat that one team, the conference champ, is getting in. Right now, it would be BYU. The teams to keep an eye on, and I'll say this, like Colorado's got a schedule where they can clean up if they go on the road and beat Texas Tech this weekend. And they're also a team that is starting to play very good football. We said this on Sunday. I'll say it again. The version of Colorado that we all remember playing Nebraska, I think that's kind of the version. I think people kind of checked out on Colorado. Said, all right, we kind of know what Colorado is. They're looking different. They're playing different. That's an interesting one to monitor. Any other teams that you want to shout out as like keep your eyeballs on because they could be making a run here?
I mean, no, not really, because after Ole Miss, I don't really see a path for like a Louisville, a Clemson, a
Yeah,
Missouri.
agreed.
Like I don't see a path for any of these teams. Again, the Big 12 team is probably the one that can certainly get in there, and that is probably a Colorado or
Oh,
theoretically
it's
an Iowa
all the
State to
Big
get
12
back in.
teams. Yeah, it's the Big 12. Every Big 12 team has a chance because you have the chance at getting it with the conference
No, I'm just
championship.
trying to think of the path. Like Kansas State, I don't think's in a particularly great position at this point in the Big 12 because they have the two losses,
Yeah.
and I don't really see Colorado losing again, and they're not going to be able to jump BYU because BYU is not losing twice. So it's like I'm trying to look at like who's got the path in. Kansas
Yeah.
State's a real long shot, I'd say, to get into the Big 12, make it happen, even though they're the
Agreed.
higher ranked team and beat Colorado. But again, like Pitt and Iowa State and Colorado are probably the two that could like upseat BYU in my
Yeah. I'm not. The Big 12 is very, very hard to like. It's chaos. It was chaos. I mean, you saw Houston beat Kansas State. Like that conference is chaos every single Saturday. I'm just gonna say there's gonna be one Big 12 team getting in. It's the team
yeah.
that won the Big 12 championship. We'll see how that plays out. Dill, I probably do agree with you though. In terms of at-large bids, I think the cutoff is 16 in terms of at-large bids. I don't see an avenue unless Pitt catches fire and Pitt beats Clemson, then maybe. But you're looking at Ole Miss down and say, I think those are the teams that, from an at-large standpoint, have a chance to be getting in. And I think as the weeks go, it's just going to be the cutoff next week's going to be 14. And then the cutoff after that's going to be, there's maybe 14 is going to be what it is because we got 12-team playoff.
Well, again, I don't know that I totally definitively say that because, again, there's like, if the SEC really cannibalizes itself hard, let's say like in Tennessee drops them to a team they shouldn't, like they could get in with 3 losses. Like it's not totally impossible, especially if like A&M, LSU, Ole Miss, like those teams also get upset. So again, there's avenues for SEC teams to get in with 3 losses, but I think it's all going to come from this group because you're right. Like a South Carolina, I don't see how they could make their run. I think it's a crime, frankly, that they're not on this list. I think that is certainly a top 25 team, but I don't see how they can like inch their way back in unless they can win that conference, which they'd need like all hell to break loose.
We'll cut it out there. I think it's going to be chaos. Again, with 12 teams, the conversation is going to go down till the Sunday they announce the 12 teams that are getting in. We'll continue to update it. We'll probably take some deeper dives into these rankings in the next couple weeks. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate y'all. And we'll talk to you guys later. Peace.